In this episode, I speak with Beena Sharma from CCU International, a startup which has developed small-scale modular carbon capture technology to capture carbon from hard-to-abate industrial sites. Beena argues, controversially, that the utilization of captured carbon reduces demand for fossil fuel and therefore supports the transition to net zero. I was a bit more skeptical about this, about whether actually carbon capture and utilization perpetuates the use of carbon dioxide, especially in the food and retail sectors. But more on that in the podcast itself. I started off by asking Beena what makes her startup different from existing carbon capture technologies.
Carbon capture technology can be used. Well, our specific technology is what we call point source. So we capture the emissions at source. And typically we can apply that to any chimney, exhaust, or flue stack. So any industry that emits CO2 through some chimney, exhaust, flue stack through their process. So that could be industries like refineries. It could also be waste to energy plants. It could be steel and paper mills. It can also be from construction processes, but also from manufacturing, which is one of the bigger ones. But also you could apply it to things like the shipping industry as well.
And are there particular industries that you're looking to target, or is it any of these your technology can be used to
Yeah,
capture?
well, the we're industry agnostic. And I think most point source technologies will say the same. The challenge is that although we would like to think that we can target any industry generally, there will be limitations. So, for example, the shipping industry has its own complexities. They're mostly out at sea, so there's all sorts of complexities around the space that's available. So that will determine which technology they adopt. But other industries, particularly, we talk a lot about hard to abate industries.
Mm.
And the big sort of oil refineries, the very large plants, are relatively easier to do because it's easier to capture. You've got a lot of emissions. You generally have a lot more space. And the processes can be quite complex, which, things like large refineries are quite used to. The biggest challenge is that we talk about the hard to abate industries, and these are the industries that maybe it could be your steel and paper mills that are much smaller. They don't have access to storage sites to store the CO2. They don't have access to pipelines. They don't have the space, maybe don't have the hundreds of millions of pounds to deploy technology. So these are the types of industries that we specifically target, the hard to abate industries. The other stuff is relatively easy to do, and there are many, many competitors of ours in that space because a lot of our competitors are very large, very industrial. But actually, our technology was designed to support predominantly the sort of SMEs and the hard to abate industries that don't have the space, don't have the money to deploy in such large quantities, and certainly don't have the resources to do this on their sites.
And so, what
So
is it about
we,
your technology that makes it on that small scale very
yeah, so
useful?
it was designed. So we have to understand carbon capture goes back many, many years. One of the first patents for carbon capture was nearly 100 years ago, and we've been using carbon capture for different things really over the years. But it's more recently that we've really started to focus on, okay, we actually need to do something about the emissions that we capture in order to prevent damage, harm to the planet, and increase the likelihood of climate change. So technologies typically have been adopted and designed and developed by large industries like the oil and gas industry. This is why you see a lot of technologies that are large, that are energy intensive, and mostly use hazardous substances. So they're typically chemical processes. Anything that requires a chemical process is going to be complex, and it's going to be large, and it's going to be difficult to scale. So one of the remits we had when we were looking at this, and it was actually one of our co-founders that was working on one of these very large, energy intensive chemical hazardous substances process some years ago, and discovered that it was after 2 years they decommissioned because it was just too large and energy intensive, and it didn't work very well. Scaling chemicals doesn't really work well. And he came away from that project saying, if carbon capture is a key technology in getting us to net zero, then it absolutely has to be smaller, it has to be modular, it has to be easily scalable. And we need to not ignore the hard to abate industries because those are the ones where we can make a real difference. So the design of the technology was focused around two things. A, being able to support the SME industry, so being small enough and mobile enough and easily scalable to go with the ambitions of the particular industry or the site that wanted to gradually increase or decrease their CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. And then the second remit was really to focus on what we call the life cycle analysis. So the question we should be asking, and we ask a lot of questions in the industry, right? Investors ask us a lot of questions and emitters ask us a lot of questions around the cost of capture. And really, and that says it all, the cost. It's a cost exercise. We don't want, we
Mm.
didn't, we never wanted it to be a cost exercise. So we focused on the life cycle analysis because we believe that the question that emitters and investors should actually be asking is what are your carbon efficiencies? So for every 10 tons of CO2 that you capture, how many tons of CO2 are you actually using to do it? Because that will give you a clear indication of what the cost is, what the energy requirement is, and typically what the size of these things are. So our focus was on making the life cycle analysis as robust as possible, ensuring that our carbon efficiencies were as efficient as possible. And in the process of doing that, we ended up designing something that we wanted to deploy to the SME industry, but it was small enough, it was modular, and it was easily scalable. And actually, interestingly, where this started from was one of our other co-founders who was working in the e-fuel space. So this is all about what you can do with captured carbon. And for many years, for his research, he couldn't actually get hold of captured carbon. And then he became involved in this project and thought, well, actually, if we can build a modular and portable capture system that allowed us to go from site to site, i.e., going to the steel mills, going to the paper mills, and capturing the emissions, bringing that back to the lab, and then being able to do the research. The idea was we could go to different emission sites, bring the CO2 back, and do the research into what we can create uh, from it. And that is really where it started. So the team went about designing something that was able to be portable, to be moved around. Effectively, it goes in a trailer. Our first prototype goes in a trailer and it drives around sites. It's been deployed to some steel plants in the UK, and literally you just hook it up to a trailer, drive it to the next site.
Mm.
Half a day to hook it up. And in the process of doing that, we realized that actually this might be one of the smallest, most compact, modular, easily scalable carbon capture technologies on the planet. So the intention wasn't to create initially the carbon capture system that would be deployed to these sites to emitters all over the world. The intention was we need to get hold of captured carbon to be able to do the research. So it's almost like a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, you had one of our co-founders, the professor at the University of Stirling, working away on these projects, realizing that the large industrial capture systems weren't quite suiting the bill. And then on the other hand, we have another co-founder that was actually designing something so he could get access to different emitter sites to get access to the carbon. And that is really essentially where
Mm.
the design came from. And we very quickly realized that it was very suited not just to the SME and industries like steel and paper particularly in the UK, but suddenly we started getting a lot of interest from some of the larger emitters, particularly in the oil and gas and utility space, that said, hold on a second, not only is this, smaller, modular, but one of the other things you don't do is use hazardous substances. So we don't use it's not a chemical process, it's a physics, it's physics behind it. It's a physical reaction that takes place, which means that we don't have the complexity of scaling chemicals, which means scaling, particularly for any industry, is actually really quite easy to do.
That's really interesting to provide that sort of background. And so, could you talk us through what happens to the carbon once it's captured? How does that work? Where does it end up?
Yeah. So the process itself, without obviously giving too much away around the IP, but the process itself, if you imagine, we connect up to the chimney or flue stack. So before the emissions go up the chimney or flue stack and into our atmosphere, those emissions are made up of a number of things. It depends obviously on the site, what's being burnt. So it could be a combination of CO2, carbon dioxide, there could be nitrogen in there could be oxygen in there could be sulfur in there. It all depends on the makeup of what they're burning. And the cleaner they are burning, the cleaner obviously the emissions. So if they're burning things like wood and paper, then the emissions tend to be cleaner. If they're burning, I don't know, municipal waste or biohazards or anything like that, then obviously the emissions are quite different. So every industry chimney, exhaust, and flue stack, the emissions will be very unique, which is why you need a technology that has the ability to adapt to what is going up those chimneys. So typically what we do is we will attach to the chimney or exhaust stack before it goes into the atmosphere, and all the gases will pass through our capture system, which is what we call pressure swing adsorption. So it's all done under pressure. That's why I say that there's no chemical reaction involved. But the gases typically will pass through our chambers. It will attach itself to a sorbent material that we use, which is the non-hazardous sorbent material. And then under different types of pressurization and depressurization, all the other gases will pass through the chamber and it's only the CO2 that remains. And then we depressurize the chamber and the CO2 drops out. Now,
And
the
where does that
interesting
CO2 go when once it's been
Yeah,
captured
so
then?
the CO2 is in its gaseous form, and
Mm.
we then need to be able to. The challenge for any type of CO2 that's captured, well, typically conventional technologies will use heat, they'll use water. We don't use any of that because it's not chemical process. We don't need to heat it, we don't need to cool it, we don't need to add any water. So the CO2 that comes out is an anhydrous gas, and that CO2 doesn't need any processing or scrubbing or cleaning, unlike other technologies, or dehumidifying for that case. But what we do need to do is we need to be able to get it into a liquid form so that we can transport it so that it can go on and do other things, which I'll come on to. So the first stage is we get it to a stage where it can be liquefied, and then we put on a liquefaction system which liquefies the CO2, which then allows us to transport. Now, if we had an emitter that also needed the CO2 in its gaseous form, then it would then we wouldn't need to do that liquefaction stage. But typically, as with most things, you can't just transport gases around the country. You do it in its liquefied form. So we liquefy it, and then what happens to the CO2 is dependent on what we are able to do and dependent on client or customer needs or off takers. So a typical example, or one of the simplest, might be that we think about carbon dioxide goes into virtually everything we touch and feel, from food to beverage. Every time you open a can of Coca-Cola, or if you're in Scotland, Iron Brew, then there's CO2 that's in that, and CO2 keeps things like foods fresh. It keeps salads going for longer. Most people don't realize how much CO2, carbon dioxide, actually goes into. But it also goes into, apart from sort of food and beverage, it also goes into things like construction material. It can go into fuels, for example. And one of the big projects that we're working on at the moment is looking at taking captured CO2 from the steel and paper mills in the UK and converting it into the next stage, which goes into ethanol and then eventually into what we call chemical surfactants, which goes into virtually every cleaning product: shampoo, shower gel, washing up liquid, dishwasher tablets, etc. So most people don't realize that. It also goes into paints, goes into plastic manufacturing. So the challenge now is who is going to be able to want CO2, captured CO2, as a feedstock, as them being an off taker. So we look for partners who can take the CO2, who are interested in taking captured CO2. So sustainable aviation fuels is a big one for us as a European mandate, and globally there's a target of getting to for most countries, most regions, is 10% sustainable aviation fuels by 2030. There's two things you need from that: captured CO2 and hydrogen. So, we've got a shortage of captured CO2. In fact, we've got a shortage of CO2 full stop. So particularly for the food and beverage industry. Now,
Of
because we
course,
don't use hazardous substances, we can also put it into food and beverage.
yes, yes. I mean, I suppose the crucial question here is it's brilliant. It's very important to capture the CO2, but it all depends on sort of where it ends up, right? I mean,
Mhm.
famously, it used to be used to for enhanced oil recovery,
That's
being
right. Yeah.
pumped back into the back in to get even more emissions. So do you have any sort of thoughts on that in terms of, obviously this being a very sensitive topic, of are there any uses that you wouldn't want your CO2 to be deployed in, or
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversation around, you hear people say CCUS doesn't work, CCS doesn't work. I think the really what they're saying is the storage part doesn't work. And that is because we haven't proven it on a large scale. I know Norway have been doing it for some time, but the UK have been working on this for 16, 17, maybe 18 years now, and we haven't really stored any significant amounts. I think trials have started this year, but we haven't really stored any significant amounts. Now, when we look back that many years ago, this storage, carbon capture and storage was meant to be our sort of golden ticket to getting to getting to a stage where we didn't have to worry about climate change. Well, guess what? It's not happened. And as much
Right.
as I won't say, I'm not anti-storage whatsoever. I do believe that there is an opportunity to be able to do something with CO2 from a storage perspective because of the vast quantities of CO2 that we have, particularly existing in our atmosphere, that we have to do something about. And so there's some of the technologies that I have access to from a utilization perspective just is not there's not enough demand for captured CO2 for us to be able to create that cycle. That's a much longer term plan. So the vast quantities that we've got of CO2, we have to do something. And storage is not the solution, in my opinion. It is one of the solutions. And I think this is where we've gone down this rabbit hole. And it is largely due to the lobbying of oil and gas companies to government, is that most people in government that I speak to do not understand utilization, do not understand the U. And that is purely because their focus has been storage for so long. Our argument is we're not against storage, but we need you to government and globally, people all over the world need to say, okay, we're not storing large quantities of CO2 anytime soon safely, then do we need to look at solution now? And we are the now solution. We are the circular solution.
Right. But I suppose if you're utilizing CO2, then it's not being removed.
Yeah, there's that argument too. So this is a challenge that we have, not with some governments, but certainly in the UK, is that utilization isn't really recognised as a way to reduce CO2 emissions. In our view, there needs to be recognition of it. So if you think
So you
about,
think it does reduce emissions?
yeah, if you think about it's more of the word that we quite often use is avoidance.
Hmm.
So if you think about the project that we're working on, Flutichem, okay, so the chemicals industry will typically take extracted carbon. So fossil fuels that are extracted, I think it's something like 5.2% of all the fossil fuels that we extract goes into materials and chemicals. The idea is that companies that are involved, the Unilevers, Procter and Gamble, these types of companies that utilize these chemicals in their process and their follow-on chemicals that go into products, they have to rely on virgin fossil fuels because there is no alternative right now to virgin fossil fuels or CO2. Now, if we could utilize captured CO2 in their processes, then that prevents the demand, that slows down the demand for fossil fuels in their products. And ultimately, if we are going to get to net zero, we have to stop mining fossil fuels. That's a given, right? We all know that. How do we stop mining fossil fuels? By doing something called enhanced oil recovery doesn't stop that. What does stop that is if we reduce demand. And so what we do is effectively by utilizing the CO2, and we're not quite there yet. Eventually, we want to get to a place where we could potentially create a full circular carbon economy where the CO2 just consistently gets reused or recycled, but we're not quite there yet. We have to take those first steps. And if you think about companies like the Unilevers of the world, they're heavily reliant on fossil fuels for the products. How do they get to net zero? Because they don't have an alternative to fossil fuels. So the only other alternative is if they can decrease their reliance on fossil fuels and increase their reliance on captured carbon. Because let's face it, we're going to be burning fossil fuels for a long time yet. And only then you see this gradual increase of reliance, which overall will reduce demand on fossil fuels, which means that we burn less virgin fossil fuels. So that is not recognised currently, and we are working. It's some of the work that we're doing with government at the moment to be able to recognise it because it doesn't come up when you're talking about carbon credits and the carbon credits market and trading, etc. It's just not recognised, and we need to get there.
Yeah, I suppose the difficulty isn't it, is to ascertain when it is having that sort of beneficial effect, if you see what I
Mm,
mean, like where you're reducing the demand in this transitionary way as we transition away,
yeah.
um, as a sort of reduction or insetting, and where it becomes like, are you actually perpetuating a sort of industry and allowing it to continue, and actually maybe there could be greater steps taken or more pressure applied even. How do you sort of navigate that?
Yeah, the key thing here really is reducing demand on fossil fuels. Because let's face it, until for as long as we need fossil fuels, which we do, it's in everything we touch, feel, eat, drink. For as long as we need fossil fuels, we're not going to be able to transition away from it. We don't consider ourselves we're not the solution. We are part of the solution, but we're also a transitionary technology.
Mm,
So most people talk about sort of renewables, and yeah, it's great. We've got this amazing vision to move to, wind, hydro, geothermal, whatever that might be. But ultimately, we've got this massive transitionary period in between where we are going to have to burn fossil fuels unless we don't eat and drink, and we don't transport anything, and we don't wear anything. And so we recognize that we can't change the industry in that regard. But what we can do is we can support that transition to a point where renewables becomes efficient, cost effective, etc. So although it could be argued that we are allowing the industry to continue doing what it's doing, our focus isn't storage. Although if there was access, I mean, we can do pipeline grade. Our focus isn't storage. Our focus is the utilization piece. So I think the argument is stronger when you are utilizing the CO2 for things like enhanced oil recovery. That's not something that we do. I'm not saying it's something we will never do, but it's not something we currently do. That's not our focus. But if you are capturing CO2 and utilizing it back for enhanced oil recovery, injecting it to get more oil out the ground, then yes, there is a strong argument for um, you know, supporting the industry to continue. Our work is focused on reducing demand, which is actually the only way that we can slow the industry down and gradually move reliance to renewables. You can't do it unless if we get to a stage where we don't want it and we don't need it, then production isn't going to happen, full stop.
mm. So presumably, because you're not storing that carbon, the industries that are emitting that carbon can't claim it as a reduction or a contribution towards their net zero targets.
Yes, yes. And this is the challenge. This is the challenge that we have with government. There is very little recognition of the work that we do. And it's a pressure, because at the end of the day, when you've got investors saying to you, well, you can generate revenue by storing the CO2 because you can get carbon credits, and you can get subsidies from government, you know, but another form of storage, which is one that we're working on, is mineralization. So we can actually take the CO2. We work with technologies, we're partnered with technologies that can take the CO2 and put it into a mineralized form, which then
Mm.
goes into products like construction materials, cement, et cetera, et cetera. And that is where you are then able to get subsidies, and you are able to generate carbon credits, revenue from carbon credits. But ultimately, if you look
Because
at the
that's
business
permanently
model,
stored, sorry,
yes,
if
that's
it's
correct.
construction, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's permanently stored. So
Mm.
again, there
Interesting.
has been very little, and although that is also a form of storage, there has actually been very little regulatory support for that. Some of the funding that's available for carbon capture and storage has never been accessed for carbon capture and mineralization, because it's not widely recognized, it's not widely talked about, because the focus is, let's be honest, the oil and gas industry, who have the much stronger voice when it comes to lobbying and when it comes to educating. That we really need to start focus on. When we talk about utilization, we also include the mineralization, but it is also a form of storage. And there are other ways that
Mm.
it's just not, most people, when you think about storage, you think about geological storage, and there are other types of storage. And there's a big education piece that's needed around that. Not particularly in parts of Asia, for example. So if you look at Asia, if you look at India, if you look at Hong Kong, for example, you'll see that their focus really is about two things. And Singapore is a prime example, right? Singapore, I think 3% of their GDP comes from exporting chemicals. Why would you capture CO2 and put it under the ground when you can capture CO2 and put it in a chemical to create a green chemical, low carbon, sustainable chemical, and sell it at a increased price, and increase your GDP. So some parts of the world do not talk about the S at all. And most people don't know that. You go to Singapore, it's all CCU, there is no S. And then if
Mm.
you look at places like India, where they also don't really have the geological storage sites available to them, they're talking about creating construction material because they're going through a huge growth period. And they're also talking about green chemicals. So I think we, particularly in the Western part of the world, our focus has been storage, and it needs to move away from that.
Yeah, I suppose the response would be, wouldn't it, in both when it comes to the sources of the CO2, those industries, and also, like you say, the industries that are utilizing that carbon, is that there are hard to abate sectors and there are easy to abate
Mm.
sectors. And, maybe the hard to abate ones, this is great for because
Mhm.
they're not going to, it's just not something that they can switch. They can't switch to reducing their emissions
No,
very quickly. But the easy to abate ones, maybe, you know,
yeah. It's
is a bit of
interesting
a
you
different
say that.
situation. Yeah,
Yeah,
what's
it's
your
interesting you
approach to that?
say that because right. So the easier to abate industries are the ones that they're mostly oil and gas and refineries, the big power utilities companies, and they do have mostly access to storage sites. The challenge with hard to abate industries, apart from the fact that they are hard to abate, majority of them do not have access to pipelines or storage sites. So storage is never going to be an option because the biggest cost of when it comes to carbon capture, apart from the capture, the other biggest cost is transportation. And
Mm.
if we look at, we currently get all our food grade CO2 from Europe, and the cost of CO2 just over the past few years have gone up three, four, fivefold because of that distance that the CO2 is having to travel. Now, if you think about hard to abate industries, the small industries, if we just think about the UK, in some of the parts of the UK where they're not coastal regions, these industries are kind of they've kind of populated in one area. They don't have access to a pipeline. They don't have access to a storage site. Chances are they probably wouldn't anyway because they're not big enough to get that sort of access. What do we do with the CO2? It's We haven't thought about this, and their cost goes up exponentially because they have to go that further to do something with the CO2. So we need to look at localized solutions. We have got in that region, we will have large number of companies that are utilizing CO2. So this is the madness of it, right? If you take a carbonated drinks company, for example, they will be buying food grade CO2 at, let's say, could be anything from £300-400 a ton to 1,500-1,700 a ton. That's food grade CO2. At the one end of their manufacturing plant or their production plant, they are emitting CO2. So there's emissions going on, which is going into the atmosphere. At the other end of the plant, they are buying CO2 in its liquefied form to then turn into its gaseous form to then use in their carbonated drinks process. It's absolute madness. The carbon footprint involved in buying the CO2, getting it transported in, turning it back into its gaseous form, the energy required, when actually on the other side of their plant, they're emitting it out the other side. Or there could be an industry, one of the hard to abate industries just around the corner that is actually emitting it. Why are we not creating those localized solutions for these hard to abate industries? And that is where utilization comes into a much bigger play than storage for the hard to abate industry. So they're hard to abate for two reasons: because of the type of industries they are
Mm.
and the type of emissions they have, but also because they don't have easy access to storage sites.
It's really interesting. And it's very interesting to hear about a different side to it because, like you say, it is so associated carbon capture with the storage, um, and not so we don't talk so much about the utilization. Um,
No.
we're coming to the end, but I'd love to just ask how you're doing as a startup or SME, and how I'm not sure how you talk about yourself, and what's the sort of next 12 months looking like for you? Where are you headed at the moment?
Yeah, we've had quite the journey. So we started our commercialization journey about just over 2 years ago, actually. But we are backed with 12 years of R&D at the University of Sheffield. So I guess, yeah, we're considered a startup still, but we've probably achieved, as a startup, we've actually achieved more in the space of 2 years than some of our competitors have done for 15, 16, 17, 18 years, which is quite an achievement. We've won loads of awards. The next stage for us is, we've deployed the technology to a number of sites. We've got a prototype which has gone out on a project called Sustained Steel from the University of Sheffield. And then we've also deployed for the Flutachem project, which is focused on the chemical sector, and that it is with Unilever, Procter& Gamble, Johnson Matthey, BASF, and many other partners. And that's a world first. So that we've captured CO2, compressed it, liquefied it, transported it to Germany, Ludwigshafen, BASF, and that conversion to ethanol has taken place for the next process to happen. So it is a world first, but for us now, the challenge is scale. And I think, investors will say the same, emitters will say the same. It's great, you can do 100 kg, it's great, you can do 1 ton a day, but can you do millions of tons a day? My response is often, well, who is doing millions of tons a day? So, the scaling element now for us, it is we're moving on to a much bigger system now. We've designed out and we're hoping to deploy that possibly in the Asia or Middle East region to a large emitter. And that enables us to show that actually we can scale tenfold. We've managed to scale tenfold in our first year. And now we want to show that we can scale another tenfold. And that shows that scalability is feasible and that it's possible using the technology that we've had. I think once we get through the next scale of our capture system, I think the offers will come flying in, I'm hoping.
Fascinating. Well, I'd love to just keep asking you more and more detail about this, but we are at the end. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I've learned a lot, and yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.